Hello and welcome to this edition of New Humanum. My guest today is Angelo Frangopoulos. He's the Chief Executive Officer of GB News, an organisation which is really making waves in the British media. When I sat down with him, we started talking about the values which are important to him and which have formed him as both a person and a journalist. Angelo, thanks for doing this interview and agreeing to be on the New Humanum channel. You are now one of the significant journalists in Britain. You're heading up this new channel which has caused waves. What are the personal values that drive you in this job? I know you're a man of faith yourself, so how does that play into what you're doing here in this building?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. I think this is the first time I've actually talked about this aspect of my life in relation to my career. And to answer that question, I think back to my start in journalism. So my first job was in a little TV and radio station, Mid-State Television, 2GZ in Western New South Wales. And I remember going in for my first day with the news editor there, who later on became an MP, and he said to me, right, so one of the first things that you'll need to do is actually go down and get some stories. And I said, okay, great. And of course this is before Google and all the other bits and pieces and social media. And the task that he gave me was to go down to what we call in Australia the main street, the high street, and introduce myself to each shopkeeper and then come back with 3 stories. Yep. And so the lesson really was one about community and who you are serving. And I think that has really sort of stuck with me all the way along. And I learnt from Peter Andren was his name. He's passed away sadly now. But Peter's big lesson was that journalism is actually not about other journalists. It's actually about serving people and that whole concept of service. And when you start thinking about a community and providing a service and providing something of value, then you start thinking about, well, I can either denigrate or I can actually add value and make the community better, stronger, and obviously exploring issues and so on. And that has really stuck with me to this day. And I like to think that with each place that I have worked at and each place that in the latter part of my career I've led, that there is that element of that little newsroom in Western New South Wales that sticks with me. And it's not overly a position of faith as such, but one of values. And I do think that journalism has lost its way in terms of the core values of what we are here to do, and that is, to serve communities, to serve our audiences. And that's why here at GB News I often talk about we don't have an audience, we have a community, and that's where the whole People's Channel positioning comes from.
See, like you, I started in local journalism, and one thing you learn in local journalism, of course, is that your connection as a journalist with the local community is quite an intimate thing. And you get feedback, and you get something wrong, someone comes in the front door and tells you about it. That's very different from working in national media, of course, isn't it? Because here one is in a sense, the community you talk about at GB News is of course a national community. So it's not the same thing, but the values you talk about are human values, aren't they? You're talking about doing the right thing by people, is that it?
Yeah, it is. And I came from a working class background. I think I'm the first person on both sides of my mother and father's family to go to university, for example. My dad was a cab driver, and my mum worked as a process worker in a factory. So for us it was, my father Greek Orthodox, my mother Catholic, and she grew us up as Catholics, although we celebrate every possible festive event in the Greek Orthodox calendar. But that was really, I think, the bedrock in terms of the values that I was brought up with. Dad has passed away now, was very much about, he drove cabs, but he talked to everybody. And I actually see that as a form of journalism. They often talk about taxi drivers knowing what's going on in the world. And I sort of picked up on that. And it really has sort of stuck with me, in addition to the experience I had in my first job, that unless you have a relationship with the community that you serve, then you end up producing journalism for other journalists.
Yeah.
And you can see that is a big problem here. I mean, journalism awards judged by other journalists, is all about rewarding journalism that's impressed your colleagues. But it's the real connection with the community that matters. And sometimes that means that you have to do things that upset your colleagues in journalism because they just think it's not aligned with the craft. But I see journalism as not a job, but I've always seen it as almost like a calling. And if you scratch the surface on most journalists, there are those who do it for ego, and that doesn't last very long. There are those who do it because they like writing, but I think the most successful ones are the ones that actually do it because they want to add something. They want to have a connection. And really, there is an element of, spiritual spiritual background to all that as well, which I think is really important.
So back at home, you had your dad was Orthodox, your mum was Catholic. Was religion then something which was always apparent to you in the house as a boy? I mean, did you know that your parents were religious? Was it a factor in life?
I think we were Easter and Christmas religious family. I went to St Mary's Cathedral, which is the cathedral in Sydney, and I did all my high school education there. So that was, we had masses, and there was I think I served as an altar boy on Sundays, and that was part of it. But that's not really been a central part of my sort of spiritual journey. Mine has been somewhat outside of the realm of the organised church, and more about just the things that I have learnt that are important to me, and the values that are important, as you go through life. And of course, you're always being challenged. There are things that go wrong, but if you've got that bedrock, it's a really great sort of starting point. And being, my wife and I, we've got 5 children, so values and sort of what I like to consider them almost as sort of key pillars of the year, which reaffirm what's important. And I think it's much more than just Christmas and going to mass or church on Christmas Eve. It's about celebrating. I think there's an important thing about the values of celebrating family every week, and family is a real central part of, I think, certainly my upbringing, and hopefully what we are on passing to our children as well, I hope.
So this is sort of formation, isn't it? Your formation was at a Catholic school, and I think I also went to a Catholic school, and if you're in that environment, you just absorb the values.
Well, you don't have much choice but absorbing it. You're at mass every second day.
Yeah, well, they used to beat us if we didn't absorb them.
Yeah, so I'm part of that generation.
And so you carry these, of course. So you have this bedrock formation as a child, and you carry that into life. But what you say about family is central, I think, and because this is where, I don't know if you'd agree, but this is where values are really lived out, isn't it? In how you conduct your family life, and that's central to you.
Yeah, there's no rule book in terms of, you don't hand your children, this is the rule book of life. You're now 12 or 11 or whatever the age is, or 16, and this is what it's something that you learn. Because I always think being a parent is part of the journey as well. I'm learning all the time, but sort of building in those values and those, if you like, those tent poles of what the key principles are of what's a family. A family is a community, the closest community you're ever going to have, and I think I've observed over the years the decline of that family unit. I think as a lot of us have, and I often question as to how critical that decline is in sort of surfacing some of the other issues that we have across the community.
And we have a terrible rate of family breakdown in Britain. And that is something which I noticed that actually, that is something which quite often surfaces in your coverage here at GB News. Is that a sort of calculated thing on your part?
It's not overt. It's not overt. I think when GB News was started, and we've been on quite a journey over the past 2.5 years, it was really about trying to surface the things that others are not talking about. One of the reasons why we resisted for a very long time having an office in Westminster, because if you report where you report from, in effect, the issues that you report on, and that's why we've really tried very much to focus on getting into communities, talking to people. We received hundreds of emails an hour from people just wanting to converse, and I think. Ultimately, channels like GB News are a companion, and there is something special about being invited into someone's home. You know, there's a choice. You've got a remote control, and you can choose a whole range of channels. So either you're welcomed into someone's home, or you're not. And obviously, our job is to make sure that people feel that they can welcome us in there to actually have a conversation. And some of those conversations are difficult, but at the heart of it, our aim is to be a place where people can feel safe to talk about things that otherwise they would feel unsafe talking about. Family is sometimes difficult to talk about. Values are difficult to talk about. Western values even more so, because then it's almost got like a political aspect to it. But we live in a country that has really led the way in terms of the way a Western democracy should work. I mean, I choose to live in this country. I love the United Kingdom, and I'm really proud to live here, considering that it is the template for the Westminster system, which I experienced growing up in Australia. And I do think that if we focus more on those core values, those pillars, if you like, that will make a positive contribution to the community. We want to be helpful in sort of providing a forum for conversations.
Yes, I mean, it's true that the British history as a sort of pioneer of democratic norms is a very noble one. But when you look at the country now, the problems are so very evident, aren't they? I mean, for instance, this question of family breakdown, where we have this huge rate of instability in families, kids brought up without fathers, and the sort of instability of relationships that there are in families. This seems to me to be one of the main problems confronting the country. And I think that in what I've seen of your coverage, that seems to me to be more prominent in your coverage than it is on some other stations, I think. I just wonder why that might be.
It's not overt. I think we are just setting out to talk about things that are different. We could spend all day talking about the minutiae of some minor scandal in Parliament. Whereas the reality is that's not really moving the dial in people's lives. They're focused on things. I mean, look, life is tough. Relationships are tough. Nothing is easy. And I think one of the challenges we've got around the culture that we've built up over the years, and the media's got a really big responsibility for this, is that it's easy to perceive yourself as having failed because you've got this rosy aspect of everything so good, and the celebrity, the cult of celebrity, for example. They're driving nice cars, getting onto private jets, etc. We're all human. We've all got challenges. We all go through journeys, and I think that we need to remind people that it's fine to find stuff hard.
Yes.
And that's why that journey around belief and values is sometimes a difficult road, because it's just not easy to talk about.
But you do. I mean, you do programming, which is actually specifically. I mean, Calvin Robinson, I know, who's left the channel now, but he was doing stuff which no one else was doing. I mean, was that? I mean, it's your decision, presumably, how you cover religious stuff.
Yeah, we lent into religion as a topic, because religion is another difficult thing to talk about, because it immediately gets politicized, and it's unfashionable to talk about Christianity, for example, in a Christian country. You'd think that would be a little bit odd, but I think that's partly the media has led us down that track. Religion and Christian values are really important to the success or failure of any Western country, I think. And that's not to say that there isn't we are literally a broad church as a nation. I mean, I grew up as a very multicultural Australian. To me, multiculturalism is a positive word, not a negative word, as it appears to be here in the United Kingdom. But we explore lots of things. I mean, I think some of the issues that Neil Oliver raises about values and Western values, some of the things that Nigel Farage talks about of the importance of relationships between countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. They're all issues that are really pivotal, I think, for the health, the well-being, if you like, the spiritual well-being of a country, and those things that we'll continue to look at and continue to explore.
I mean, you're right in as much as I think the media in this country, the big media in this country, it puts religion in a small, discrete area, and it treats it as a minority subject. I just wonder why you think that is. Why is it that? I mean, I've been a journalist all my life. I would say that the industry we both work in is a highly secularized industry. It's not an industry where it's easy to talk about religion, is it?
I've never thought of it that way, because I've never felt I've had to hide my beliefs and my values from that perspective. I guess I think there's a broader conversation around what's happening in society, is that there's a sense that that you are taking a position that may be perceived to be against one or two or a variety of other groups in the society in which we live in by talking about Christianity. So it's basically, let's not touch it because it could cause us problems. Yes. Right. So I think it's more from a fear perspective rather than an objective. Well, we don't want to go. That's only going to cause us trouble, right? And I think you saw the controversy over a big UK retailer's decision to change an ad because of certain colours that were being used in a scene where something was being burnt in a fire around Christmas time. To think that to see that there is a sensitivity that really is out of proportion, I think. Yes. I think the main thing to me is that I think we need to get to a point that we are confident enough as journalists to talk about what we believe in and what we believe in terms of the values of why we are journalists in the first place. I mean, I often think to myself, and when I meet people, I often ask, why did you become a journalist? And there is a variety of questions. Very rarely do I get that sense of, do I actually get the response that is, well, I joined because it makes a difference for the community. And I do, I mean, quite frankly, it's interesting that you had a similar background to mine. I think the decline of local journalism has got a lot to, plays a big role in what's happening right now. Because you go from a very protected school environment, and you go into the university world, which is, ultra secular, and then your first job is straight into a metropolitan newsroom, and you never get that whole exposure to, the high street, the butcher, the shopkeepers who are doing it tough, paying their business rates, the importance of the local church in the community, and the stories you end up doing around some of the social work that's been done out of the Church of England, for example, and other churches and communities. And you end up basically being in this zone that you can't help but being secular, because that's all you've been exposed to.
Sure. I also think that actually the industry these days is far more glamorous and sought after than it was in my day. So, British regional local journalism was, I loved it, but actually it was, it wasn't high status, it wasn't particularly glamorous, really. This is back in the 70s. I wonder if our reticence about talking about Christian values, about Christianity, is something to do with a rather a sort of an exaggerated politeness, British politeness. It's as if we feel we can't talk about Christianity because we give offence to Muslims or Hindus or whoever, whereas actually I don't think it does give offence. I don't think it gives offence to other religions.
I think there's a reluctance to have pride in this country. I think that's something that really struck me as a migrant coming here. I'm very proud to live in the United Kingdom, and I'm looking forward to the end of the year when I'm eligible, should the United Kingdom take me to become a citizen. But I don't hear that back from people. And I won't name the organisation itself, but when we were building GB News, we had a very early meeting with a creative agency who was talking about what you wanted the channel to look like. And I said, well, we're going to be proud. We are going to embrace the Union flag, colours of the Union flag, and we're going to be proudly British. And the response I got back was, oh, that's not a good idea. You'll be characterised as being, ultra-nationalist or whatever. I said, no. I mean, there is no greater logo in this country than the Union flag. And bit by bit, we finally got them across the line, because obviously we were the client, and I was not going to have, some other colour scheme, because it's about pride. And it's interesting. We've been playing the God Save the King, God Save the Queen initially, obviously, at 5:59 and 30 seconds every single morning now for nearly 2 years. And it's a small thing, but it's we've never had any pushback at all. No. And I think it is a politeness thing where you don't want to be seen to be too proud. And I think one of the challenges that we have here is that, and I think Christianity sort of falls into the same bucket, if you like, is that yes, it's important. Yes, it's part of our culture, part of our history. We celebrate Christmas. I know it's important. The values are really important, but let's not talk about them, because it's a bit uncomfortable. It's not. I'd rather talk about problems with the potholes or problems with the NHS, etc. And I think the positivity. I think if you think about values, you end up with a position that you end up being more positive about the world that you're living. And that's a great challenge for journalists, actually, because journalists generally trade on the negative. There's this crime, there's that crime, there's this, that, that controversy, this person's lost their job, blah, 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 blah. But again, I go back to my starting point in that little newsroom in Western New South Wales. And one of the briefs that we always would get, why don't you go out and find stories that celebrate good things that are happening in the community? And there are plenty. And I think that's where we really want to kind of get to here at GB News. And that's different. We don't really celebrate the positives. And there are so many positives here.
Well, I agree. But I also think that there are many problems also, of course. But let me ask you this. So you talk about values, and of course Christian values are it's interesting to me. I sometimes hear Christian values categorized as right-wing. So you have the idea of right-wing Catholics. So, for instance, people who might. So, if you are, let's say, you have a sexual morality which is quite strict, and it frowns upon, it disapproves of promiscuity. So that would be one issue. Or if you are against abortion, for instance, if you feel yourself against abortion, that is categorized actually by some people. These are categorized as right-wing opinions. Do you think there's something in that actually Christianity is tarred with the brush of in some way being a political faith?
Yeah. It never ceases to amaze me how politics always ends up in any discussion around values. And it seems that anything even approaching, when you talk about family values, for example, right? There is, what's wrong with the family? Family can be made up of all sorts of different mechanics these days, but it's fundamentally, a small community of people who look after each other and want to live in a really harmonious, loving environment. That's not right wing.
No.
I'm really sorry. That's human, right? And
but it is categorized as something.
Well, and this is the problem. It's you got to ask yourself the question: who's characterizing it as that?
Yeah.
And is that political in itself, right? And I am not right wing. My viewpoints are quite broad, as most people probably are. And yet, as soon as you express a viewpoint that may not be ticking some kind of a box, then you are instantly put into that penance, if you like, of you're just a right winger.
Yes.
I believe in the power of the individual. I believe in that if there's a problem, then try to find a way of solving it yourself rather than relying on someone else, if you can, of course. I believe in that we should all be living in a community that we actually, look after each other, and regardless of what your viewpoints may well be.
Does that spring? But that springs from your Christianity.
Well, absolutely. I mean, these are core Christian values.
Yes.
But they're not. This is the thing. Like, they're not characterized as that. They're characterized as just being a good person. But ultimately, what has actually made the world work, the very successful Western world work, are these core values. And I think we need to just be mindful of the fact that we need to champion them, feel positive about them, and not feel like it's something that you hesitate to talk about. And that's the reason why I've done this today, is because I do think we need to start talking about what are the values that make our world and our society the success and the wonderful place that it is today.
I salute you for talking about this, because these things, talking about personal faith, talking about Christianity, this can be very uncomfortable for people. And I wonder how your values sit with that mass of young journalistic talent you have just out there outside this room. I mean, do you find yourself, these youngsters that you employ, do they share your values?
I don't know. I've not.
Do you talk about these things with them?
Well, I think we talk about journalism and what journalism is, and obviously our senior journalists, we all have a viewpoint about what journalism is. But the reality, everyone's on a journey, right? And I'd like to think that our focus on local stories, having journalists that live in the communities which they serve, is by action showing that we are different. And I wasn't given a big lecture in my first newsroom, but I learnt that I could actually make a positive impact in a community. And a brief example, I was sent to a town called Parkes, and parks there was a major controversy about the way the parking would be laid out. And I turned up thinking, well, there's a parking story. But what I found actually was a story that really meant something to people because it affected the businesses in town. It affected people who'd never learned how to reverse park. Basically, it was angle parking. And I came back from that story thinking, I thought of that story as a parking story, but actually it is about a community struggling with change. Yeah. And that's what I kind of trying to think. I always think back to stories like that I've done as a young journalist. That ultimately, we are all dealing with change. Things are different. Things are tough. And if we just come back to the basics of what journalism is supposed to do, it is supposed to make things better, I think, and expose things that are wrong, and lead to solutions, and celebrate what's positive. Because as I say, journalism is not a job. It is a calling. Because if you treat it as a job, you won't last very long at all.
Tell me, so you were brought up in this. So here you are. Here's Angelo as a young boy in a house where mum is Catholic, dad is Orthodox. Did you notice? Do you think there are many differences? Is there much difference between being Orthodox and being Catholic?
I think I'll take Catholic Christmas every time, and I'll take a Greek Orthodox Easter every time. So we had the best of it. Well, I never saw any difference between the two, quite frankly. I think Greek Orthodoxy has got a huge focus on Easter. And I found that because my mother is Spanish, the focus around Christmas was very different to the focus around the Greek Orthodox Easter. But for us, I just saw it all as the values are the same. It's Christianity. It is fundamentally the same. And I think as I've grown up, I've thought of religion and faith as not being within the paradigm of any church as such. And in fact, in my late 20s, I found myself going on a Sunday afternoon to a Baptist church, only because I found it was a great celebration. It was a music, and I'd never experienced something like that because Greek Orthodox church services were very pious, and yes. And then the Catholic ones were sort of lacked a lot of energy, and so and that to me was just, I think, quite formative to me because it made me realise that it's not a paradigm of an organisation. It is something around values and yes. Something that you have inside you.
I think that me too, actually, as I've grown older, I've come to see the different flavours of Christianity as being complementary rather than antagonistic. Of course, there are frictions between the various faiths, but the crucial thing surely is a belief in God and a belief in Christ and the Christian values that you talk about. And these things are common to us all.
Yeah, they are. And I think, for me, one of the most spiritual moments is actually just standing on a beach looking out at the ocean. And I find that really spiritual, much more so than being in a church. I think ultimately life is about values, and to not have that overarching, I think, spiritual outlook would be very. I think the world would be a lot less
impoverishing.
Colourful. Yeah, it'd be very much more impoverishing. Yeah.
Yes,
I think so. And that's not to say that not having one, makes you an inferior person or anything like that. Because I do think everyone has got a journey that they're
sure.
You never stop travelling on this journey.
No. It isn't for us to condemn.
No, of course.
And judge people who don't have faith.
But they may well have their own values and their own faith that drives them. And I've lived in the Middle East, and I think that some of the families that I've met have got, their faith structure and their values are not dissimilar to the faith values within the family that we have. And I think that that's something the more we can celebrate what we have in common rather than what we have that makes us different, I think is a great opportunity for us as a community.
But there is a difference, isn't there, between those people who, like us, believe there is something beyond the here and now, beyond the concrete and material, and there is something which is, these are impossible to, people have struggled down through the centuries to put into words these things which I'm struggling now to express, which is this sense of something beyond us, God, and the ineffable, the indescribable, something out there which is not purely human.
It is challenged, gazillions of people over time, it's difficult to talk about because it's hard to explain.
It is impossible, in fact.
And it is impossible. But to me, it is about those pillars, and I just keep going back to the core pillars of what life is about and what community is about: the sense of family and a sense of service and a sense of community, and and the rest of it will sort itself out.
But those values you talk about spring from your Christian formation.
Yeah, well, I think that they spring from the family unit which I grew up in. They spring from the rich sense of family from both my Greek and my Spanish heritage, and they live to this day through the children and the lives that we try to lead with them, and even in a place like GB News, for example, where we are trying to we approach journalism differently around that sense of community. That's ultimately what we are. The world is a community, and I think that's the great challenge for us to make things better.
You did allude to the fact earlier on in the interview. You just said that you'd had this has been a startup, and your first 2.5 years have been not without problems, which we don't need to go into in detail. But the point is, I wonder how much you have needed to rely on these values you speak of, your Christian values. There must have been times when it can't have felt terribly easy to be the CEO of GB News. Am I right?
We've had our moments. I think the one thing that having a spiritual belief builds is resilience. And my view on life is that you've just got to keep going and keep steady on your path. And there are, you're always being dragged all sorts of different directions. And the fact that so many people wanted us to fail only made me even more resolute in actually wanting to succeed. And we're a long way from it. We're on our pathway now, but I do think resilience and having a belief and having those values do help you through. And I have faith in people as well, and I have faith in what we are trying to do, which is, again, deliver journalism that is, based more of a calling rather than as a job.
Maybe someone's answering your prayers up there.
Perhaps. Long may they do so.
Angelo, thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.